Well, thanks for coming out. My name is Guy Bays. I run data for Lyft. Data at Lyft is basically data platforms, data engineering, and a whole bunch of data applications that we build. Before that, I was at Facebook for about 6 years, and then before that, I've done all sorts of crazy stuff in my career. Everything from like big brokerages to television networks to giant fusion lasers out in the desert. But pretty much the whole time, it's been data. So I'm glad to be here, and I'm happy to answer any questions and share like what little wisdom I've managed to accumulate through making many mistakes in my life.
All right, I'm Jasmine. I'm Director of Data Platform at Clover Health. We are actually an insurance Medicare Advantage company, but using data to improve healthcare. Our data engineering team, we have some representatives here, is about 15 people right now, and then the data science team is about the same size, so you can imagine that's fun. I don't have the same varied background. Before software engineering, I was actually in finance, which is only barely relevant.
I'm Noelle Saldana. I run a data science team for Pivotal. Has everyone heard of Pivotal? All right, and especially if you were in the last talk, you hopefully have heard of Pivotal, which both is a PaaS company as well as has a consulting arm. So we have both data scientists and data engineers on our team. I have been at Pivotal for 7 years or so now, and I've been doing data science before data science I think was called data science, and so happy to be here too.
Yeah, so I guess today we're going to be talking about hiring in data, probably from both sides. From Pete's question to the audience, it looked like a lot of you are hiring rather than being hired, but I think you've all probably had the experience of being on the other side of the table and have had some frustrations. Just curious, a quick show of hands, how many of you have had to do a lengthy take-home assignment as part of a data science or data engineering? All right, so we'll be touching on that. And how many of you have seen job descriptions where you're like, this company does not know what a data scientist is? Fantastic. Well, we'll touch on things like that as well. So that's a good transition to my first question to the panel. And just, what is data engineering and data science? At this point, is this a well-known mainstream field, or are there still things that are being figured out? How would you guys define the work that you do?
There's a great blog by Monica Rogati about the hierarchy of AI needs. I don't know if everyone's seen it, but it has AI at the top and goes down through everything from like data cleaning down to like data gathering. And I think that there's like a natural, like fuzzy line in the middle of it, where I think data engineering would be at the bottom and data science would be at the top. But everybody, I think, in the field has skill sets across all of those, and depending on where your emphasis is and depending on what company you work for, defines it slightly differently.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I very much think of the skills as a spectrum, and when we actually started thinking about it like that for hiring, it makes a much more effective hiring process because you're not looking for like silo corners of that spectrum, and it's much more easy to evaluate holistically. I definitely don't think it's a mainstream idea yet. It's a mainstream buzzword for sure. But like no, I believe that it's very much dependent on the company, and the more important thing is for your company to define it crisply for its own goals and needs. It doesn't really matter how the rest of the industry defines it, as long as you can communicate what division of that is for your teams.
Yeah, I would say for data science in the industry, like the term is hopelessly screwed up at this point. Like you really don't know shit about a job if it's in data science. It could be anything from like requires 3 PhDs to do autonomous driving to like as long as you know a little bit of SQL and you can monkey some Excel, you're in business, right? Yeah. So it's really important to read through the job descriptions and find out like, okay, like what is this person really looking for? And what do they really want? What is success for this job? What are the skills that are coming in? I think data engineering is better formed. Like data engineering almost always means like taking raw data and transforming it into something that's usable and efficient and accurate and easy for customers to consume. But the methodologies of doing that can vary quite a bit too. There's sort of like the old school data engineering world, which is mostly like tool driven, like ETL, Informatica, things like that. And then there's sort of the newer Silicon Valley approach, which is much more of a programmer's job and much more lower level and usually dealing with like much larger volumes of data.
Yeah, and on that note, I think there's also like a difference between the tools writers versus the pipeline writers and how much of the front end of data you touch.
Yeah, one thing I was curious about, I don't know if in the past, probably at past jobs, certainly not at your current employers, but has somebody come to you and said, you understand the data, tell us this, how can you fix all our problems? Like, have you had somebody ask a very ridiculous question to you that somebody that's not familiar with the field would think data science can solve?
Oh my gosh. As a consultant, so I've been a consultant now for several years, and I'd say especially when the article that came out about data science is the sexiest thing, we got a lot of that. And I think to this day you get that. There are people who don't know what it is, and so they'll come. We get people like, I've been told my CEO or by the whomever that we need to do deep learning. Great, what kind of data do you have? Like, it's all structured, or like it fits in Excel. I'm like, you keep using that word. Like, I don't think you need deep learning. And so every few years there's a new handful of terms that I see like people who have been told by someone else they need AI or like the next best thing, and in order to do that you need to hire a data scientist. And that will magically help fix their problems, and it's not like it
magic bullet wrapped in the Holy Grail.
Yeah, it doesn't really happen.
Well, Guy, you mentioned that in some cases people are requiring 3 PhDs for autonomous. Something that's top of mind for me. Autonomous driving. In a lot of ways, data science and data eng hiring are still a little more Wild West than other fields, probably even more than software engineering, which is a bit older, certainly more than law and medicine. So part of this is, what your own backgrounds are, but also when you are hiring for your teams and you are looking at a candidate, how can you tell before you talk to them if they're good? And probably the answer is you can't really, but what proxies are actually valuable in this field, given that it's new?
So generally you can't tell much from a resume other than where somebody worked, right? And so you can sometimes inherit certain skills if someone works at a company that's really well known for being good at a certain thing. Like if someone's doing data engineering at Google, they probably know some stuff, right? But I usually don't pay any attention to the bullets at all, honestly. The thing that actually stands out a lot and helps significantly is open source contributions. Like if someone can provide me with a link to code that they've actually contributed to a project, and you can actually look through the code that they wrote, that's way more valuable to me than any resume ever. And another thing that helps a lot is blog posts or things like that are similarly revealing, where someone can show you a project they've done or give you an example of some of the things that they've actually written. Because at the end of the day, what really matters is what you can do, not how you form the words. So those are the things that often help a lot. We also generally assume that no matter what anybody says, that we still need to test for everything. So there's very rarely any kind of a pass, for the core interview.
Yeah, I think this question also applies for general software engineering, right? It's very similar. There's no credentialing process in software engineering, and what are you looking for in a software engineering skill set? And so for me, I think the most important thing is some sort of depth being demonstrated. If somebody's jumped around a lot or only written glue code or kind of dabbler, I think that is not necessarily as valuable. And I think depth can be demonstrated not just through professional contributions or open source, but blog posts or whatever. And then specifically for data, some sort of affinity for data is very important, that curiosity about why do you care about data, and that demonstrating that you're willing to dig into issues. I think that is a quality that is substantially different for this field than some of the other.
One small note or tip I would give about resumes to demonstrate that depth would be to quantify what you've done, in terms of data, right? People, they're oh, I've had experience with data. That's great. How much data was it? Was that a gigabyte? Was that a terabyte? Was that?
It was an Excel sheet.
Was it an Excel spreadsheet? And if you're trying to say oh, I've worked with big data, what does that actually mean? Stay away from the buzzwords. And if you're applying for a place that wants you for your quantitative skills, you should be able to tell them what the volume of the data was, at least on your resume. So.
This is a bit off topic. I just remembered this joke. Somebody compared big data to teenagers and sex, right? Everyone's talking about it, everyone thinks they have it, but no one's actually doing it, right? I mean, my opinion on resumes is that they should die in a fiery pit. So I certainly agree with you guys. If you were to mention some red flags, right? So I think it's very hard to tell if someone's good from a piece of paper, but I think sometimes you can tell if someone is unequivocally bad, with some margin of error, of course. So are there certain red flags that pop out?
Yeah, there definitely are a few, like, just lack of care in the resume itself, like spelling errors and things like that just seem egregious. The other thing I've noticed is, like, if you can't even figure out, like, what they are claiming, like if the resume basically doesn't make sense, that's like I'll read this blurb and I'm like, what is that even? Like I don't even understand what you're trying to tell me, much less like, what did you do? Any kind of like bizarre formatting. Like sometimes you get resumes with like mugshots and stuff, and it's like, that is just poor judgment, Like, just stay away from that shit, right? Yeah, but other than that, like usually it's just tell me where you've been and what give me a job title and a general feeling for what you thought your role was, and then we'll test for the rest of it.
Yeah, I kind of already mentioned some of the orange flags for me, and then I think a lot of the other stuff is standard resume stuff, and definitely hate buzzwords. It's just not. There is a game of optimizing for that because recruiters do search for that, but
or if ATS is automated, right?
Yeah, but it's really difficult to read as a hiring manager. And then when technologies are combined together in a way that don't make sense, that's very, very telling.
Yeah, so it's probably in a lot of ways, if you're a hiring manager, it's easier to tell what depth looks like than if you're a member of the recruiting team who may not have domain expertise, right? So how do you guys work with recruiting to keep them from falling back on credentialing that, especially in a new field, may not carry as much weight as they might like to think?
So the recruiter that I work with is fantastic. She was here yesterday, I think. So I don't have a lot to worry about for that. I think for her, she is really good at actually tying back the data points, like having the conversation with the candidate and then revisiting the resume and then doing that feedback loop. So for me, I don't have a lot to worry about.
I think it is absolutely an iterative process with the recruiters. Like you can start with things like, okay, look for this type of academic background and give them a range. Like I think part of it is giving them parameters. Like, okay, it's not just look for people with PhDs in statistics. Like there's a wide range, especially in our field. But then also to tell them like, okay, what has worked well? What's emerging as a pattern? Doing some data science, like on top of what you're doing.
I would also say that a recruiter is like any other relationship. Like you get out of it what you put into it. So you have to take the time to like train and help them understand what you're looking for and respond when they're either giving you good candidates or bad ones. And it's something you have to invest in. And then if you invest in it, like you get an outcome that's good.
Yeah, we do a lot of pre-briefs actually on the profiles, and then it's really important to talk about the profiles as the skill sets and what does outcome for success look like. And then you have like, here are possible proxies of signals for that kind of skill sets, but make a really clean mental model for that.
Do you guys ever find yourselves applying data analysis techniques to recruiting in a cross-functional way? You touched on this a little bit as an example, right? Potentially going a little deeper and looking at the kinds of signals you might be able to pull and getting predictive value from resumes or other parts of the process?
No, I actually tried really hard to get that to work, and the conclusion we came to is it just kind of doesn't work. I mean, we do a lot of analysis around like just the operations of recruiting, like understanding the pipeline and the funnel and where people are falling off and what's a healthy funnel versus a bad funnel and that kind of stuff, just to make sure that the thing is rolling. But when it comes to like crunching through somebody's resume trying to derive whether they're going to be a good or bad employee,
I've tried that too.
Yeah,
I just found typos and grammatical errors matter. Nothing else really.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think even if you just look at some of your own top performers in the team and then go refer back to their resume or LinkedIn profile, there's just all sorts of variation there. And that's already a pretty telling signal.
So if someone is new to the field and maybe they got out of a boot camp, which I'm mixed on. I think you guys are probably mixed on as well, but they're trying to get into this field, and let's assume they have some amount of skill and baseline competence. How might they get noticed? Or what can they do to get their foot in the door if they look like shit on paper?
Well, I think get a pet project. Yeah. Right? Like get involved and get your hands on it. There's, padding your resume with here are all these classes I've taken is not going to be as compelling of here's me trying to apply it. This is something that I wanted to go learn. And quite frankly, doing something like Kaggle is great, but doing something other than Kaggle. Like if you want to stand out, do something other than Kaggle on your resume.
Is Kaggle really crowded now?
I just find I think it's everybody's go-to, right? And so it's everybody's go-to, and that also a lot of that data I think tends to be cleaner because they're trying to show like apples to apples comparisons.
And most of the work is preparing the data, right?
Right. And so like if you want to show a wider breadth of your skill set, especially as it relates to engineering, I think would be more interesting.
Where can we get a really dirty data set?
Good point. Like, so shameless plug, have worked a lot with DataKind, right? And so like working with like nonprofit organizations, and they for sure do not have data people who work with them full time. And like it's not going to be quite to the same scale that you'd necessarily get in the industry, but certainly has very clear examples of these are problems that could be solved by data, and here's dirty data that you can try to do something with.
There's a lot of very interesting government data out there, like opendata.gov and stuff like that. Like it's one of the places where I wish I had more time just to play around with. I guess the other thing I'd say is the idea that you hand a resume to a job website is like the way to get a job is just like completely wrong, right?
So wrong.
That is like the worst way to ever try to get a job, and it's almost certain to fail. Like the things that work are network, projects, open source contributions are good, but you want to bring a person into it somehow, unless you're like an absolute freaking rock star and your name is like world renowned, like you need some kind of like way to bridge that gap and not just let the blind submissions. Like I remember at Facebook, we got something like 200,000 blind submissions like every year, so trying to troll through all that and find the people that are good versus the bad. The other thing is recruiters learn that referrals and recruiter sourced is like a much higher content. And they're typically, if you think about your average recruiter, he's incented on the number of hires he manages to make. So he's very careful about how he uses his time, right? He doesn't want to troll through the 200,000 in order to find one hire. He wants to use the high quality sources, which are usually referrals and people that he sources himself.
So the way I got into industry is actually I TA at a boot camp program, and then I participated in the recruiting process. But that was many years ago, so I got very lucky with my career, and I think the climate is very different now. And I would say, all these points are valid, but a lot of it is more about timing and finding the right company that is actually hiring entry-level engineers or have some sort of vision for how they develop more entry-level people. Because if you, trying to knock on a door of a company that has already decided that they don't have capacity to take on entry-level engineers is just not a good use of your time. So the networking part and understanding what companies are out there that is willing to take that chance right now, and what kind of plan do they have for growing engineers. I think that part is actually the most important for a really saturated market right now.
In your guys' view, what is the balance of bringing on junior team members, right? Because in some way you want to be that company that brings in new talent and builds them up and then takes this very long-term view of hiring. And in some cases you just don't have the bandwidth and you have to get shit done, right? So how do you think about that, and where do you draw the line?
I think it's really important and valuable to have entry-level people, no matter what stage you're at. I mean, unless you're, kind of like running out of cash or something. Because I do, actually, for a while, our data engineering team was much more leaning towards very senior or mid-level and senior people. And I had this blind spot of we have to build this foundational part of our platform, so we don't really have like that capacity to bring on more entry-level people. And then when we did, I realized like I was just totally wrong, you know, like the dynamic of the team changed a lot, because what was happening was, you know, all the senior level people kind of knew what was going on, so they didn't document anything that well, and then like they were relying on what they already know to like navigate the stack. And I think there is a tremendous amount of value to be forced to not just like teach, but also to think about like the accessibility of the software that you're building, the tools that you're building, and that is like really, really valuable to the team. But like obviously also like investing in the future generation of engineer is really important, because everybody wants to hire software engineers and no one wants to train them. I think that's just that's bogus. You know, that's doing a little bit of freeloading.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. Like, you're looking for a balance, right? The balance you're looking for can be different depending on what you're doing. The other thing I would say is when I build up a team, I usually want to have at least 1 or 2 senior engineers on the team, like kind of cornerstone engineers that can set direction and have seen stuff happen before, right? And know not to make like the common newbie mistakes. But then you also need like a balance of like more junior people, because a lot of times that's actually where the innovation happens. You know, anybody can innovate, but the junior person that's like fresh out doesn't actually know, you know, what's the established way of doing things, and sometimes they'll go in like very strange directions that actually turn out to be really valuable, right?
They'll also ask, why are you doing this way?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
You're like, why am I doing that way?
Because that's how we did it 10 years ago, but maybe it doesn't make sense anymore, right?
It's also the best way to scale, I think, right? Because if you're just trying to, like, I need to scale this thing out, the team out, and the team needs to double in size and then double again, it's going to be very expensive if you want to only hire senior people, right? And then that, to your point, like to get the right people, like you do have to do your due diligence, and it's so specialized in a lot of ways for every company, like trying to hire senior people for what you need in your company. It's better to find them and train them when they're raw talented people are great for expanding a team.
What's a good heuristic for thinking, you know, shit, it might be time to hire a junior person even though we don't really want to? Like, what are the signs that you can do it and you have the bandwidth?
Well, I mean, I just think about it as a distribution. You know, like, do I want like 20 to 30% of my team to be like, you know, level 3 or low 4, and then like another 30% to be like mid-range, and then maybe like another 30% to be senior? Or do I want to skew it in one direction or the other?
Speaking of hiring and kind of coming back to some of the stuff we talked about at the very beginning, let's talk a little bit about interview processes. So, you know, whether someone's junior or senior, you get them in. I know all of your companies do things just a little bit differently. So how do you guys hire today?
Yeah, I think everybody goes through a similar process. So there's usually an initial screen of the resume, depending on the different sources, but everybody does get screened by HR up front, like we talked about working with our recruiters, and then it goes through a technical screen. There might be some sort of technical exercise, depending on which role you're applying for in particular, whether or not
we'll
that's...
revisit that in a moment.
Yeah, if there's technical exercise, and then an on-site. And since we're consultants, part of what we have to screen for, especially in person, is how would you be in front of a customer, right? Like, how would you be presenting? How comfortable are you thinking on your feet? And then that's part of the process, and you know, lots of FaceTime with people. I think everybody has some version of that process.
Yeah, for us, I think the most important thing to me is that the interview process be repeatable and consistent. Like, one of the things that's very common, a mistake to make, is to have sort of a random interview process where one particular set of people is very hard and one particular set is very easy, and what you end up with then is like a random set of hires, right? So it's not just the different loops, you know, the different interviews that happen, but also the people that give them and the questions that get asked, you have to be very well calibrated. You know, so the idea is that you're asking from the same book of questions, that people are asking that set of questions in a way that they understand it really well, and they've asked it many times, and they know what a good answer is versus a great answer versus a mediocre answer. I think another thing that we work a lot on at Lyft is trying to make sure that we eliminate unconscious bias. Like there's a lot of unconscious bias that happens in hiring. You know, there's discrimination that just goes on in people's brains. It's hard to like short circuit, but one of the things that we found that's pretty good is like blind grading of code. So you know, the idea is you come in, you do like a laptop interview, you write some code. The person that's like there with you grades it, but we also have like a blind grader that knows nothing about the candidate, hasn't seen the resume, doesn't know ethnicity or any of that stuff, right? And all they have is the code, they grade it as well. And then we know, firstly, like we remove a bias from the decision, but we're also calibrating that actual interviewer. Like if his judgment on that code starts to differ from the blind graders, and there's a thing that needs to get resolved, right? Why are they different? I wish we could figure out a way to do that on all the interviews, but so far we haven't.
Is the blind grader like the more experienced interviewer? So
no, just a random interviewer.
Just a random. So
but they don't know anything though, right? They have no context, no resume, no nothing.
One of the cool things about Lyft is you guys actually use our product.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, you guys actually interview people never having seen their resume, completely blind as well, and I love working with you.
I love this point about making sure that you're pulling from a common pool of questions across your interviewers. And I remember a few years ago when we were expanding our data science team, someone noted, because we collect all of our feedback and we were looking through it, and we're like, are we too harsh? Like, is everyone too, like, at what point did we get so mean, right? Or did we get so, and we like pick the questions like, oh, this person couldn't state this theorem and this candidate couldn't, and once we actually like added, like, and every single person had one on there of the question they answered, like, could any single one of us have passed this interview, right? So, and we had to recalibrate and bring it down, like ask more open-ended questions and not make it a textbook exam, because that's not the point.
We have very similar processes, but there's two things that I really like about our stuff that I want to call out. Is one is on our on-site panel, we actually always have 2 interviewers instead of 1. I think that helps to calibrate some of the bias stuff a lot. Also helps to train interviewers much faster and get to convergence and consistency. The other thing is we try to make sure our exercises actually reflect what we do. So instead of like theoretical stuff, it's very much based on the actual kind of coding that you will do, the kind of domain exercise. We try to do our system design exercise in a way that like also teach you something about healthcare, which could be fun.
That's a great segue into talking about, oh, did you?
Oh, I guess one other thing, questions need to provide signal. Like a good question will tolerate a gradient of answers, right? Like it's not a binary, like either you got it or you didn't. A good question will have people that flunk it, people that pass it, people that do like mediocre on it, and you'll understand like where those watermarks are. That's a very important thing. Like one of the things I've done wrong before is have questions that rely on like a single insight, right? Like you see this insight and you get the question right, or you don't see that insight and you totally miss the question. That's actually not a good question, because like you never know whether you're going to have that insight or not, right? Or maybe they rely on a certain like piece of trivia, right? Like you know about this particular data structure, then you're in business, and if you don't know, you're screwed, right? So a gradient is important. It also lets you use the question for different levels of seniority. So like I can give this question to like a mid-level person, and I expect them to get this far. Like advanced person will get all the way through, right? You know, so it lets you kind of like level people as well.
We've definitely seen that too. On our platform, we have the same person interviewing with a ton of different interviewers, and we'll look at how they do either over time or over a short span of time. And questions that layer complexity and don't have some kind of aha thing tend to get the most deterministic results, and otherwise people are all over the place.
This also means as a candidate, don't get bent out of shape if you didn't get all of the question right. Like maybe you weren't even expected to, right? Like maybe you did better than you thought you would. And a lot of times it's more about like how you attack it and like how far you get through it, and then it is like, oh, you totally solved it perfectly, right?
The only downside of layering complexity is sometimes you have a really good candidate and they don't realize that you can just keep going forever. So they think they did really poorly because they feel like they didn't finish it, right? When in reality, they got through 5 of the 7 levels, and most people only get, like if you really suck, the interviewer will end it after 2 and tell you did a great job. So I think one of the closing questions I want to ask, this is something I have a lot of strong opinions about and want to see what you guys think, is just take-home assignments, right? What makes one good? What makes one bad? When should you use them? When shouldn't you? I know that in data engineering and data science, they're a little more prevalent than in software engineering because you're working with data, and it's a good way to see how people work with data.
Yeah, we used to do more take-home assignments, especially for candidates who were coming straight out of school. We noticed that practice, but I think what we ended up finding is that it just gave a wide range. Even though we said, this should only take you an hour, we expect an hour, and then we would get 20 pages worth of like beautifully typed things. Like, I don't think this is actually reflective. And we didn't get insight into how people think through their process. And so we moved more towards like pairing interviews for other. Pivotal. I know, and it's the pivotal way, right? And so, but yeah, I think that in some cases it might have made sense, but the variance was really, really wide.
Yeah, I pretty much hate them. Like it comes back to the idea that questions need to provide signal. Like if someone does well on a take-home assignment, the signal I have is somewhere in the world there's somebody that knows how to do that assignment. Like I have no idea that it's the person that's sitting in front of me. And you know, I've seen some seriously weird shit in interviews in my time. I remember we had an instance where the person that did the phone screen was not the person that came to the on-site. So there are no hijinks that don't happen, and like there are some like areas where people are very organized about this stuff, right? So I can't trust the signal, so I don't know what good it is for me. So I'd rather just have them do it where I can like see them do it, right?
So we do have a take-home assignment, but it's not a gate to an on-site, and we very explicitly made that decision because I think that is what leads to all the failure modes that you were mentioning. I do feel conflicted about some of the implications of like, how much time do you know this like person is spending on it, and obviously it penalizes certain categories of people. So definitely still feel conflicted about that, but I think we still have gotten a lot of signal out of them because they're not a gate to the on-site, and basically it becomes an exercise where we're kind of doing a pair programming exercise when we're doing the on-site instead of doing some other weird coding exercise.
Yeah,
for
our
that.
PM org uses it pretty well. Like they have a take-home assignment which is like present like a product you built. So it's kind of like different for every candidate. But then the thing they do that's smart is they drill the person, right? Like they're like, okay, like, and as the person is spending like 45 minutes presenting this, they ask all sorts of questions and like, yeah, really dig in. And so there's no way you could fake it, essentially. Yeah. Like, you know.
Yeah, that's basically what we do. Yeah. Like you change the assumptions. You ask about what would you do if this scope changed, things like that.
Great. I think we have about 10 minutes left. Maybe if you wonder, and I'm guessing you all have some burning questions for this group of fine people. So
we know not to send your proxy to your in-person interview. While you're thinking of questions,
like you.
I just wanted to ask one for the panel. So in my experience, I've discovered that engineers recruit other engineers best. How do you inspire, aside from the interview process, which is always distributed through the engineering team, at least as far as I've seen, how do you inspire your engineering team to get involved in the hiring process?
Well, there's a couple ways, right? Like one of them is if you're hiring for your team, it's usually kind of easy to do because you realize this is a person that you want to work with, that you know is good, and that like will do some of the work that otherwise you have to do. So for cross-team hiring, we often do two things. One is we do referral bonuses, right? Like that's a real thing. We'll also pull out like certain parts of the company where we think are struggling, and we'll sort of do a call to action. And we'll say like, oh my God, we really need Android engineers. Let's do like a ninja hunt. We'll get like a bunch of people together. We'll feed them pizza. Like we'll all go through our LinkedIn. We'll find Android engineers. We'll produce like referrals, right? And then it turns into kind of like a party, so it's fun.
I would say you shouldn't take away your engineer's agency. I think in a lot of large companies, if you want to refer somebody in, you have to go to this recruiting machine and kind of submit their name and then hope something happens. So you're using your political and social capital at the same time, right? On one hand, you're like putting in this effort, and then if the person doesn't do well, you feel stupid. And on the other hand, if it's a friend of yours, you know, like what if the recruiting team doesn't get back to them? You're going to look dumb in front of your friend, right? And social pressure is much more painful than really anything else. So you want to just reduce that friction and reward it. Like even if they refer 10 shitty people in a row, be like, you know what, this is a good engineer, just keep taking their candidates and thank them for it, and make it easy. Don't make them jump through hoops. And if they want to hire for their team, don't make that person get dumped into some central process where they're never heard from again. Much easier said than done. Certainly, at smaller companies, it's easier.
Question here.
Thanks so much for the panel. The question I have has to do with specialization and generalization. What would you say to candidates who maybe feel they don't fit into the mold of the position that they're seeing at the company they want to work at?
Yeah.
For example, somebody who is a strong data scientist, did work at a Series A stage company for a couple of years and did a lot of product type thinking too, and found they really liked that. And they have an identity now as an interdisciplinarian, almost to the point where they're not just T-shaped, but maybe they're kind of like pie-shaped, perhaps. And they like that and they're good at it. How should they talk to the larger companies, especially about that?
Yeah, this is a real problem. There are holes in a company, right? Like square holes, rectangular holes, like oblong holes. Companies really like people that fit those holes, and they will often tolerate like a little bit of deviation from the hole. But where they get into trouble is like you were saying, like somebody that's just not that, like a real honest to God, like hybrid or strange combination of disciplines. There's two things that are about those people. If you find them the right role, they can be like amazing. Like, because they bring together in their head like stuff that your company doesn't have, inside one head. And that can allow connections and ideas to sprout that is like, could really change you. The second thing is organizationally, you don't know what to do with them, right? So the only answer that I have to that is I think that good managers know this. And they will say like, okay, so you're a weird fish, like you don't fit into these holes. Like, I want that, So it's really kind of like the only thing I've ever seen is like manager intervention at the end of the day. Like I've never seen a company that actually has managed to get the benefit of these standardized roles, which they do come with a lot of benefit, and yet still be able to accommodate like the people that don't fit into them well.
I'd say I agree with that with the manager. Like I think of my own career, and I'm a non-standard hire, right? Like I don't have a PhD. Like I took one CS class as a grad student, and it was a time where they didn't know the options you had as an applied mathematician when I got started was like, oh, you can be an actuary or you could go teach, right? And
awesome.
So, great, those are my options. And I got really lucky that I had a company found a role or at an entry level that they were willing to teach me how to code, and I had a manager who's like, I see where your talent is. Like, have you ever touched R? Like, no idea what that is, right? And that, I've been able to learn a lot and, just hustle to get where I've gotten, which has been really great. But it was, kind of luck, kind of circumstance, but also believing that, like, there's something out there. Like, don't get discouraged. If you're a non-standard hire, don't get discouraged that there's, like you're round and every hole is square, right?
I think you definitely have to go out of the normal process a little bit, and then I do think the size of the company matters a lot. I think, though, it's important that if you come with a really generalist background where people can't totally fit, like, this is where you fit, it's important to come with your own, like, narrative of this is what you want to do. Because then the conversation becomes much easier. Because sometimes the failure modes of like having this like pie-shaped person is, you don't know where they're going to focus, and that pie? Oh, pie-shape. Okay, and you don't know if like maybe it's also a reflection of like they like to jump around a lot, and that things that don't keep their interest for a very long time. So I think it's important to make sure that you articulate what it is that you would like to achieve and what value you think you can bring.
Hi. One thing that came up was open source contributions and blog posts. I think for some of us who are newer to the field, we're a little more intimidated by that. And like I've never had an open source contribution, and it can be very discouraging to hear when that's kind of a filtering factor. So I'm curious to hear more about that and the level that plays into filtering someone out.
Yeah, it's not a filter. Like, it's not like, oh, you didn't do it, you can't get hired, right? It's just like a very nice bonus. You would be amazed, actually. Like, a lot of these projects are quite interested in new people and realize that exactly what you said is a problem. Like, an easy way to get around that is to just state it, just like you mentioned. Like, shoot an email to the dev list and say, like, I am new. I want to, like, get involved in this. I'm willing to put work in. And then the second thing I would say is, like, demonstrate that you're actually willing to put work in. Because there's a lot of folks that think that they want to do this, and then they realize it's actual work, and they back out. And so before the maintainers are going to want to, like, invest in you, they want to at least know that you're serious about it and you're actually going to do something. Sometimes, like, just fixing a couple of little bugs, which is not, like, super hard, you know, but, like, they've been sitting there for a while, is enough to, like, kind of earn that. But yeah, it is a thing that is, you know, hard to overcome, I think. But it won't stop you. Like, it's not a requisite for getting a job or anything.
I'll add something about blogging. I've written a lot of stuff on the internet now, but it's really scary to get started. And I actually got started on Quora because, one, you know what people want to read about, so you don't have to artificially think of a topic. And two, it feels so good when people press upvote. And then over time, you start to get a better feeling for your audience and what they want to hear about and what kind of tone works. So it's like if you're a comedian, you go to some little club no one's heard of and just try out material. Like, that's what Quora can be. And it's if no one upvotes it, then probably no one's ever seen it. So it's fine.
As someone who's like 2 months into my data eng career and came from software engineering, but I just graduated a little while ago, I know very well about studying for like interviews, especially software engineering interviews. And you mentioned that you like your interview process to be repeatable. We love it when you're repeatable because that means we can find the questions. But I want to know from your guys' perspective, how do you kind of like beat that mentality? Like, you make sure that you don't have to deal with people who just learned the question online, but how do we also prepare ourselves to handle these types of like new questions, like data engineering questions, data science questions? Yeah,
there's generally like some kind of like question database where things get marked once they are out in the wild. So usually you don't discover it right away, but you'll figure out like, oh, this question's actually out there, you know, and then you just mark it and you never use it again. And so there's a constant like shuffling. We also at Facebook, we tended to expire them just automatically after a period of time. We just kind of assume they'd get out there. I think another one is just have a big enough set. Like, you're not talking about like 5 questions or 10 questions. You're talking about like 20 or 30 or 40 or 50. And then the odds that somebody has like studied all of those things are not like super great, right? So the other question was like how to prepare for it. Like, I usually, you know, if you think about the questions we ask, they kind of fall into 2 categories. One is like just general programming, where, you know, if you're a good programmer, you'll be able to answer it. You don't really have to study. I would just sharpen up, right, on like raw programming skills. And then the second ones are usually like design and architecture, and like how would you actually like put something together. And there's really like also no way to study that, but that's where like some of the theory comes in, like, you know, complexity analysis and being able to talk about time and space constraints. Sometimes you want to crack open like, you know, the old textbook and remind yourself of like how all that shit works. Does that help at all? Yeah.
Do you think that layering complexity also mitigates people having memorized questions? Because maybe they get the first one and then you're like, let's change it up.
Yeah, you can also shake it around a little bit if you start to, you can sometimes get a feeling that, oh, this kind of feels like rote, you know, like, yeah, so let's throw some stuff in there to like just shake it up. Yeah.
Like, I love asking open-ended questions. Like, a lot of times, rather than picking an obscure data set and asking people to work on it, tell me about what your last project was. What could you have gone, if you could change something about it, now that you have it in hindsight, what would you have done differently? Why did you choose the things that you did? And just understanding people's creativity and their thought process is, 1, something you can't study for, and 2, like so much more important.
One of the best interviews, oh, sorry.
I think if you have open-ended questions with depth and variation, like, it really doesn't matter if the question is out there because people can answer in so many different ways. And
one of the best interviewers I ever spoke to was like, the point of an interview is to see if we can be smart together. And I just love that. That stuck with me. And I think that's the kind of interviewing you have to do if you subscribe to that.
Two more questions.
Yeah.
Okay, my question is, so you mentioned that like the open source contributions and the blog posts are a good indicator, whereas for me, like the blog post is anyone can write blog posts. It's not a peer-reviewed process. You can see that I'm from academic background. I love peer review. whereas an open source contribution is like strong indicator. So one thing I realized, like, or we realized that, like, right now, in the absence of like good data engineers, I would recommend our like hiring team or like the team to test if this person is moldable into like good data engineer or data scientist. What should be the things we should look out for?
Well, I mean, to me, a data engineer is just a subset of a software engineer, right? Like the most important skills are core software engineering skills. Especially people that are familiar with back-end systems can usually make that leap like pretty easily. And we actually don't require you to have had past experience, doing data engineering. We expect you to understand like back-end systems and scalability and things like that. So I think that it's like less of a barrier. I think it's probably trickier as a data scientist, but I'll let these ladies answer because I don't really know too much about that.
Well, I'm also data engineering, so.
Yeah. You're the data scientist.
What's the exact question?
So he's trying to get at, like, you're not always able to find people that exactly fit the profile. How do you find people that can learn it?
Yeah.
I think.
So it's interesting. So there's two different categories of things I look for data scientists. One is technical ability, right? So like, can they code? Or they have a capacity to code. Like, I don't really care what language, like, can they code? And then the same thing with math, right? Like, do they have some mathematical statistic instinct or background in it that they'll have some starting point? Like, I don't go through a laundry list of you need to know all of these 10 algorithms or you're going to fail, right?
Great.
How do you ensure that there's diversity on your team? Several of the things that you mentioned were about using your personal networks. Yep. And if many of us here, I think, are in tech, and tech is notorious for having terrible diversity, then how do you get out of that system? And same thing with using open source contributions. People that have the means and have much more availability in their time to actually do that. So how do you get people who have less time available because either they need to do parenting or take care of elderly parents or things like that?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for asking that question. It's real, for me, like, I care very deeply about that. And one of the things I told my recruiters at one point was like, I don't want to move to on-site interviews until I've at least screened, X number of women. I have done 20 interviews of like guys. Like, there's not where is the diversity in our pipelines? Like, well, the people who applied aren't diverse. I'm like, well, then let's add some diversity to the pipeline. I can't manifest diversity on my team if there's no diversity in my pipeline. So it's being really active about that and really like, we can't move forward to the next place if we don't have diversity. And if it takes more effort to ensure that in the pipeline, maybe they're less. Maybe we need to broaden it a little bit. I went through actually all of our, back to the resumes, like, are we prematurely screening people out because they're not non-standard candidates, because they don't have the right buzzwords, because they don't have the right background, and trying to really understand and make sure that like every step of the pipeline for us has diversity, right? Like, we're not just trying to hire so fast that we're just going to get the first 5 people and like, okay, we first 5 hires, then you do that, the next thing you're like, wow, my whole team kind of looks the same. Like 6 hires in, at what point do you stop? Like, there's no good point, I don't think, to stop and say like, oh, we should think about diversity now, right? Like, it's always too late if you've gotten to that point, right?
I think the top of funnel diversity is really, really important, because when you start to get lower in the process, it really trickles down, amplifies, and then it also gets trickier. So really investing in that is really important. I wouldn't say we have like nailed that in any way. There's still a lot more work to do. But the other thing, I think, growing people and retaining them is really important. I think a lot of people have hired a lot of these entry-level like minority background engineers, and then they just lose them after a few years because they haven't really invested in growing them beyond that level.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, right? Like, I think that if you think about diversity, it starts actually probably in middle school. We have this sociological like attempts to, for whatever reason, push women out of the more technical disciplines. And the result is that by the time you get to college, like we've already lost the battle, right? Like if you look at the graduating rate of like, engineers and whatnot, and how they are diverse or not diverse, like it's just over at that point. Like there's nothing that we can do as an industry to fix it. We can only do what we can do inside of our particular companies to like claim a larger percentage of the people that are actually graduating. So, I think that there's a lot of stuff that the tech community needs to start doing, and actually already is doing, to like address the problem at the source. The second thing that happens a lot is it's amazing how many, women and minorities move out of engineering. Like it's a huge brain drain. Like you'll have all these people that start as software engineers, and then like you'll fast forward in 10 years later, they're product managers. They're TPMs. They're moving out of an area that they think is unfriendly to them into an area that they think is more friendly to them. So there's a role that I think that all of our leaders have to play, and the team has to play on making this choice for the people that we have work really well, right? Like make them feel very welcome in our teams, make them feel very well supported. Be the wrath of God on anyone that like questions that or interferes with it in any way. Like, so that's the second part, and that's something that everybody here can do, like we're all probably in a team with a diverse person of some kind, so think about like what are you doing to make sure that like they like their job and they're sticking around and they're not going to like opt out of it because it's too much of a pain in the ass.
Yeah, and we've talked a bunch about women. I want to make sure also, like, when we say diverse, we definitely don't just mean gender diversity, because I do think sometimes like for me, myself, like I feel like I come from a socioeconomically pretty privileged background, and just because of the gender diversity part, there's probably a lot of other people who it's much harder for them to get into the industry and stay in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Like diversity is across all of the, like so many, the intersectionality, I'm going to put a term out there, it's across a lot of things.
Last thing I'll add is, there's a lot of inclusion work that needs to happen as well, but until companies start not just relying on resumes at the top of the funnel, I think we have a long road ahead of us, because if you have somebody that's looking at it, and unless they're really well trained and you've put a lot of work into making your recruiting teams cognizant of the fact that the resume is limited and they can't just look for the same 5 things over and over, you're going to filter your top of the funnel wrong. So I strongly believe in some kind of process where anybody can show what they can do. That's what I'm trying to build, but there are plenty of other things that can be done as well. But it's also not, there are no low-hanging fruit here. Like companies have to change their process end to end from how they hire and how they retain people, and it's not just about sourcing more women or sourcing more people of color or anything. It's like you have to change how you think about hiring, and there's, just like data science isn't a magic bullet for your data problems, right? Data science, there's no single thing that's going to make this better, and it's hard, and it's going to take a long time. But there are more and more women and people of color in this field. University students look very different than people that have been in this industry for 10 years. And on our platform, we have close to gender parity among juniors, and it drops off for seniors. So in the next 5 to 10 years, I'm very, very optimistic. And
it's starting to turn. I think the demographics are starting to turn.
Yeah, they're starting to turn,
I think. It will be really interesting when a lot of these people become role models. Because I think one of the things that's so hard right now, why people leave, is because they don't have role models that they can look up to and understand how the path can play out.